purpose of the interview is to do a double check, right? Is this the same person that showed up in their essays? You can have a fabulous interview and still be rejected. You can absolutely walk out of that interview feeling like you bombed and you were admitted anyway, sometimes even with scholarships.
Does the interviewer really have all of the power?
Absolutely not.
You're getting tough questions because the person has at least some degree of respect for you. It's a bit like the computerized LSATs and GMATs where they will start giving you easier questions if you get things wrong.
There are some mistakes applicants think are mistakes, but are not mistakes. If you forget your train of thought, you can navigate around that. You can say, no, I'm so sorry. The nerves are getting the best of me. Can I start that over again? That's not a mistake. That's being human. Please review your essays before you begin to interview prep because you've already answered these questions.
Sometimes some of those weak performances are also driven by nerves. Do you have any advice for people on how to mitigate those nerves, handle the nerves in the moment?
First, know that being nervous is a sign that you care about something. It is normal. Accept it. Second, get in the mode of being able to connect with somebody through a screen. And so go FaceTime mom or dad or your partner. What does it look like to be emotive or expressive on a video camera? The third thing is that sometimes you might never be able to shake those nerves. Confront it. Say it. When you get on that video call, hi, Brian, so nice to meet you. I have to tell you, I'm a little nervous today, but I'm still really excited to speak with you. It's a really dehumanizing thing.
You did it. You put together your application. You submitted the essays, the resume, the recommendations, and finally you've gotten what you've been waiting for, the coveted interview invite. You feel so close to the finish line, and yet this is like the obstacle that is standing between you and acceptance. Today, in today's podcast, we are going to talk about the interview. We're going to talk about the role that it plays in your application. We are going to dispel some myths, and we are hopefully going to give you lots of useful information that is going to help you ace your interview. Hey, everyone. My name is Maria Wickvila. I am the founder of ApplicantLab.com, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Brian Phoebe, the founder and CEO of GuruFi.com. And we're joined today with Kelsey Kephart. Kelsey, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Maria. Excited to be here with you and Brian. My name is Kelsey Kephart, formerly admissions at Columbia Business School, where I did everything from reading applications to making final decisions on applicants. More recently, I've been in finance and then run and founded Embark for the last 11 years.
Excellent. Thank you. So your perspective as a former AdCom is going to be incredibly useful, I think, today in terms of really dispelling those myths. So why don't we get started with some of the most common myths that tend to keep applicants up at night? I think maybe one of those is, let's get started with, is the MBA interview similar to a job interview, or how is it sort of similar or different?
Absolutely not. It is not a job interview. If you think about a job interview, you've passed a lot of stages. This is kind of like the last check to go on to the next stage. And that's absolutely not what happens in the MBA world. If you are lucky enough to be invited to interview, of course, it's really exciting. It means that at least 2 people have read you by that point and have said, this person's admissible. They could be in the class. Sometimes, and I can say this from experience, in that review that I did with folks that are being invited to interview, sometimes I pick things out that I'm a little concerned about and I want the interviewer to dive into. And so for that reason, there could be a lot of things happening when you get to that final admissions committee. So no, the interview is not the last hurdle. It's not like a job interview. There's a lot of things that happen after interview in that final admissions committee seat.
All right. And the second question that we had is, I'll flag for you what I think is the concern in this question. It says, if I nail my answers word for word, I'm set. And it's that word for word part that makes me a little bit worried. What's your thought on that?
If I take that question, I think what's behind it, someone says word for word, I've got a script, I'm going to nail it. I already know what I'm going to say. You don't know what your interviewer is going to ask you, especially when you get into the more nuanced ones like Harvard, especially Wharton, Sloan, but even the more traditional interview types, that is coming from a Kellogg or a Booth or even a Columbia. If you walk in there with a script, you're not ready. And so you really have to be flexible in terms of behavioral questions, sometimes even your why MBA. It can come in a lot of flavors. Why are you interested in our school? What is your lasting impact? And so I stop right there and say, if you have a script, you're preparing wrong.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, if I can, I'll make a couple of points. The first is that if you have a script, and I've had people ask me to help them write or revise a script, and I'll always tell them this is a terrible idea because one, there's a performance element. And unless you're a trained actor, like even if you get exactly the question that you want, it's going to be really hard for you to deliver that in a way that seems natural and compelling. And the second one is you're not likely to actually get exactly the question that you want. And having interviewed people in a lot of different contexts, there are a few things that are more annoying than I ask you A, and you give me something like, yes, but what I really want to tell you is B. Because that just tells me like, okay, you're not actually respecting the process. You're being a little bit disrespectful or flippant towards me. Or kind of the best case is like, you haven't really prepared or you're not psychologically prepared to have a conversation. You're just here to give a series of canned speeches.
I think that's absolutely right. I think interview nirvana for me and my clients, or even when I was in admissions, is that you feel prepared to answer any question. And no doubt, there is some element of being a really good interviewee where you actually feel like you have a little bit of agency, but that's not going into arrogance. Like, for example, if this is a blind interview and the interviewer is maybe not so good, which I think we should also talk about too, what happens then. But if they ask you right out the gate, why MBA? Well, that person doesn't know what your goals are. And so sometimes it actually makes sense to pause and say, you know what? It's a great question, but I'm going to back up and tell you a little bit about my goals. But really, if I'm going back to the crux of your question, Brian, it's you cannot have a pre-scripted thing because you're going to set yourself up for failure.
Yeah. And to Brian's point, like it is very easy to tell when someone has memorized something unless they are very skilled at improvisational acting. Like you might not think so because, for people who maybe don't interview or, either perform as interviewees or perform interviews, they might not realize that they're coming across as scripted and robotic, but it's so obvious. And yeah, to your point, Kelsey, like you have to be flexible, right? You have to actually listen to the question being asked and you have to think about what information do they already have about me? So that example that you gave of why MBA is a perfect one. Like if that's the first question that you get, then obviously you have to give some background. But if it's like the fourth question that you get, then you're going to have to tailor your answer accordingly. And I think authenticity is really key in these answers that you're giving so that you can generate that rapport with the interviewer. So I think this is great advice. You mentioned a second ago, like what happens if you get maybe an interviewer who isn't that experienced or who isn't that good? Is it true that the interview itself is like the be all and end all? Does the interviewer really have all of the power?
Absolutely not. That is certainly not the case, right? I mentioned previously, right? In order to get interviewed, you already have at least, one or two people on the admissions committee who say, this person looks promising. There have been many times when I was in admissions and somebody looked like they bombed the interview. But if you really dig into it, maybe that's not the case, or maybe they bombed something that wasn't actually important. If I can back up and tell, our listeners a little bit about the process that actually happens, when somebody finishes their interview and they go up for committee, it's colleagues sitting around usually a very large table. First, we read the syntheses that happened of the reviewers, right? Then we looked at everything all over again with fresh eyes. Did we miss something? Was there a nuance? Then we read the interview report. That was the last thing that's like additional color. And then a pretty large discussion started to happen. It was pretty rare that everybody was unanimous. And so sometimes there's pretty spirited discussions that happen. I can remember times where I was absolutely heartbroken that I went up to bat for somebody, but I was overruled. There were times where, most of us did agree. So there's a lot of nuance that I think applicants just don't understand that actually happen in that room at the time of decision. Therefore, going back to your question, Maria, the interview is not always the end all be all. You can have a fabulous interview and still be rejected or waitlisted. You can absolutely walk out of that interview feeling like you bombed, and maybe you didn't bomb, but maybe you truly did, and you were admitted anyway, sometimes even with scholarships.
That's very relieving, I think, to hear for a lot of our listeners.
And on the topic of bombing, if someone comes out of an interview and they feel like they were tough, right? Maybe they felt like they got grilled. Does that mean that they bombed their interview?
Not always. And I think, the three of us working with so many clients, I'm sure that each of us can readily remember a client who sent us a panicked email and said, oh my God, this is terrible. And everything turned out absolutely fine. So anything's possible.
A couple of things I'd like to follow up with that. So my brother, who's a doctor, every test he's ever taken, he's told me before he got the results that he failed. So one, there's like a lot of people who are just really bad at assessing how well they did.
Yes.
And what you will remember in a 15 or half an hour interview are like the 6 seconds where, oh my God, I stumbled over a word or I seemed like an idiot. And that's what you'll loop over and over. The other person might not have even noticed it.
Yes.
And then secondarily is that a lot of times, like, we were talking about this before we started recording, that you're getting tough questions because the person has at least some degree of respect for you. It's a bit like, the computerized LSATs and GMATs, whatever, where they will start giving you easier questions if you get things wrong, right? And so, if you get, do you love mom and dad? That's kind of a bad sign. And so to me, it's not necessarily the case that, oh boy, they're really taking it to me, is they think I'm a terrible applicant.
Those are really great points. And I almost want to pull them apart. A lot of folks who are applying to these MBA programs are type A, are very hard on themselves. And that's just a personality trait they're always going to have, right? Some of my strongest folks who I run through interview mocks end that and say, Kelsey, I did so horribly. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You did absolutely fine. Like if you had an interview in 10 minutes, I would think that would go perfectly well. The second part is there are some mistakes applicants think are mistakes, but are not mistakes. You have to know that the person on the other side of the screen or the table, they're human too. They've probably been in your position. There's a lot of admissions folks who either got the MBA, did the interview. These are alums or students. Okay. If you forget your train of thought, you can navigate around that. You can say, no, I'm so sorry. The nerves are getting the best of me. Can I start that over again? That's not a mistake. That's being human. Now, if you do that 5 times, it's probably a problem. But if you do that once and maybe that gets the jitters out and then you really loop on your performance, that's totally fine. That is not a mistake.
And speaking of mistakes, I think another perception that people have is that the interview is only about selling yourself and presenting yourself as perfect and here are all of my accomplishments and aren't you impressed with me? I'm so impressive and I'm perfect. And what would you say to that?
That's absolutely not what you're trying to do in an interview. If you take a step back, okay, what are admissions committees trying to do? Is this person a fit, right? Do they have a strong track record of accomplishments or excellence? Are they a future good student, right? Part of my role and part of everyone's role in the admissions committee is you have to be multiple people. You have to be obviously an admissions committee person. You have to put yourself in the shoes of career management services. Is this person likely to achieve their goal? Are they going to be a problem? Are they going to be a good future classmate? So am I a future student? Would I like talking to this person? Or is this person going to be such a know-it-all that they're insufferable? You have to be future alumni association members. Is this person going to be a contributing member? There's a lot of roles that you have to think through. What would this person succeed at and potentially be a problem at? So there's a lot of roles that somebody's trying to play the movie forward and say, what is this person going to be here?
Can you say something about like what I sometimes think of like as the everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten aspect of this? And in the sense that like, I feel like a lot of interviews that I've conducted have gone sideways for some fairly low level things about presentation, politeness, just simply being present. And it's funny, like people will prepare a lot of kind of higher level stuff, figuring out things that are related to the school or whatever. But it's like, well, get the basic stuff correct first, right? How you dress, how you present yourself. Because I'll just give you a fast example. The company that I owned before GuruFi, my co-founder and kind of business mentor, one thing that he would do before interviews, and he brought me in, this is not in an academic sense, but in a professional setting, is he would actually have the two of us man the front desk as secretaries, right? So that when people came in for interviews, we were the ones who talked to people. And it is amazing the percentage of people that are rude to secretaries. And I know that more and more things are like online now. But people would be shaken when they would sit down for the interview and it was the two people that they were just not very nice to 5 minutes ago.
Right.
And so how much of that in your experience has been part of the process of, because I only bring this up because you talked about like, do I want to be classmates with this person? That part of it is just like, get the basic stuff right. Like, don't allow yourself to be tripped up because you were not a great person in that moment?
I mean, that was huge. Is this person a jerk? Was a huge thing that I thought about, that I carried with me. I mean, almost all the admissions committee members are traveling, right? We each had a territory. And something that I would do at either information sessions on the CBS campus, sometimes I'd collect business cards. And if somebody gave it to me and if they were a jerk, I'd write it down. And then I'd go into their application and write a note like, hey, this is something that, the admissions committee, my colleagues should absolutely know. And that could absolutely get someone rejected if they were, I'll come up with a quick example. This is very extreme. I did an information session at the time. We'd done them in the evenings. And so I ended around 8 p.m. I headed up to my office to pack up. And when I exited and went down the stairwell, there was someone trying to get more time with me. Hey, I just had a couple more questions. And I made sure to get their name. And so I put a note on their file. I don't remember if that person ever applied, but that was just a very extreme example of you need to have emotional awareness in the admissions process. And many of these folks, to your point, Brian, some of the stuff is virtual, but I would man the front desk too. And so I got to meet a lot of people. Don't get me wrong, they were all negative interactions, but when it was bad, that could absolutely get you disqualified. There is, to your larger point of get the basics right, there's so much information available online in today's age, what to wear, how to send a basic thank you note, how to open up an interview, how to make small talk, that it's kind of the level of something that if you don't get that right, it calls into question what that person is actually doing or what they're like in real life or something that's important.
Yeah, I've also been in that. I used to man the admissions booth for HBS at the MBA fairs in LA before I launched my business. And it was just some people would just they would try to monopolize my time. And I'm like, you're actually making a bad impression. My favorite one ever was I was at a Forte Foundation, Forte Foundation being a nonprofit that's trying to improve or increase the number of women who are attending business school. And I was at a Forte MBA fair, and a cisgendered male presenting biological male showed up, and not only was I'm like, what are you? I was like, look, what? And he was like, well, I knew that this would be a smaller MBA fair, and I knew that they wouldn't tell me no if I signed up, because of course they're not going to say you're not allowed to come. But the spirit of the event was not for people like you who already have other avenues to get information about business school. So it made such a negative impression on me, because it's not like he was like, well, actually I identify as a woman. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. He totally was like, yeah, I this is my loophole that I use to get into this MBA fair. And I'm like, dude, that's actually the worst thing you could. Anyway, so I think we've all been there. So going back to the different schools, different schools have different values or slightly different things that they're looking for. Do you think someone should keep those values in mind when they are interviewing, and maybe research them? I think they should, but I would love to hear from your perspective. Did you ever interview someone who might have been a great fit for another business school, but who maybe didn't quite fit Columbia's values? And maybe they should have reinvented themselves, or modified what they were going to say to make it more quote unquote Columbia specific.
I feel like I have so much to say about this particular thing. So, I mean, in my opinion, all the schools are basically looking for the same thing, right? They want leadership, they want empathy, they want teamwork, they want excellence. All the schools, in my opinion, basically want the same thing. To say that, Harvard really wants somebody who's a true leader, well, that's to say that other schools don't. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Or that Stanford really wants somebody who's entrepreneurial. They send a lot of people to Wall Street. So to try to show up to your interview and say, okay, well, this one I really have to do this thing, is kind of defeating the purpose. You come across as deeply inauthentic. Also, it's a lot to keep in your brain. You've got enough to, think and prepare. So I think that's sort of a false thing to do. Additionally, if you are someone for whom, if you're at the interview stage, sure, you've got, the basics. But if you have only leadership stories in your brain because you think that's what the HBS interviewer wants, then what if you get a question about, one of the essays that you wrote, and would you do that thing differently? And that was actually a question about empathy. Well, are you going to get thrown off? So I think that by trying to go in there and say, well, Sloan really wants that, experiential learning versus something else, you're already filtering what the interviewer might want from you or what you actually might say.
And does it make a difference who's interviewing you? The kind of prevailing suspicion is that if you get interviewed by a member of the admissions committee, that means they're more keen on you. But if you get matched with an alum or a second year, then that's just kind of demonstrates that they're less interested.
Nope, absolutely not. That is absolutely not the case. When I was interviewing folks, and I interviewed a couple hundred folks every single year, it was probably because they were active duty military on a base or in a submarine and they had a bad Wi-Fi connection, or I couldn't pair them with anyone, or they were in the Nepalese mountains and it was going to be a phone call. So that was really a logistics thing. Or sometimes they said, I just picked someone out of the pile. I said, I really want to interview them. We all did that. It doesn't matter who your interviewers are. Don't read into that thing. And not to say that, there's a lot of schools like Sloan, you're interviewing with an admissions person. HBS, you're doing the same thing. Whereas with Tuck, you're probably interviewing with a student. And so schools have planned, a lot of thought goes into this. Who is the right interviewer for you? But if you get an admissions person and you were expecting alum, don't read into that.
Yeah. And actually, this is a question when you said like the schools have put a lot of thought into this. This is something that I try to convey to people as well. And I'd love to hear the Columbia specific aspect of it. But sometimes people are worried about like, oh, the second year student, how are they trained? What if they don't like me? And I have tried to convey to people that if a school is using like a second year student, that student, there are like anti-bias trainings. Most of the schools will have explicit anti-bias trainings for interviewers to make sure that if they have any biases that they don't work their way in, or they'll have very specific trainings for the students themselves, or the alums or whatever it might be. So can you comment upon like maybe for Columbia, like was there any sort of training or like a checklist or some sort of thing that was required of people to become interviewers?
Definitely. And I'll say, I'm not at Columbia anymore. The processes could have changed. But at the time, there were trainings. There were, hey, here are some questions that you are totally fair game. Here are questions you should not ask, either for legal reasons or it was a weird question. There was also a process of auditing, right? I would look through almost every single interview report and see if there were patterns, right? There were known entities of alumni interviewers who were really tough. And when we got to that final admissions committee, we say, well, it's with, Bob. Bob's really tough and he loved this person. That's worthwhile. Or Bob didn't like this person. That's pretty par for the course. So, yes, there are processes and systems. Really what schools are doing, especially when they use alums and current students, they need to make sure, because it's really a brand risk, that if somebody has a really poor interview experience with that person, they could go on to Reddit or to GMAT Club and say, I had a really bad experience. I've had, and maybe all three of us have had experiences with maybe a client who has had a bad interview, a particularly bad interview. And there's a process to surface that in a respectful way that doesn't jeopardize. Look, that happens like 1 out of 10,000. And so nobody should come into your, gearing up for battle or anything. But schools have processes to train, monitor, and loop on what their interview process is with anyone.
So real quick, if somebody does have like a really bad interview, like for example, I once had someone basically told, it was a female candidate, and this was in a country where women don't have quite as many rights. And her male interviewer said to her, well, don't you think that women are meant to stay home? Like, why are you even applying for an MBA and have all these career plans? Women are meant to stay home and be mothers and wives. And that was pretty awful. So I gave her in that case, I did say to her, like, look, you should reach out to the admissions office and just let them know that you got this very inappropriate question. What would your advice be if you do end up getting something that is inappropriate or that you feel might be crossing a line?
Maria, your advice is spot on, right? If it rises to the level of inappropriate, and really there's a differentiation, right? Unpleasant can mean a lot of things, right? They were tough on me, they really grilled me. That's not inappropriate. Inappropriate is really questioning anything to do with, gender, religion, race, anything like that absolutely isn't appropriate. Guiding that person to say, hey, admissions committee, heads up, this thing happened. I would report it as objectively as you possibly can. No doubt it's painful and frustrating and all these things. But if you say, hey, my interviewer asked me this question or said these things, wanted to let you know. That's really what you should do. And I think you should do it, sooner rather than later. Don't wait until you're accepted or don't wait until you're waitlisted. Report it. It's worthwhile.
Can you say something about what you think are best practices for interview preparation? And also kind of post-interview thank you notes, follow-ups, things like that?
Sure. I think interview preparation, you have to know the school, right? Different schools have different modalities. And so let's pretend it's like, for one that is like a Columbia or like a Kellogg. The first thing that I advise my own clients to do is there's questions that you know you're going to get. There are questions that you absolutely have to nail. What are your post-MBA plans? What is your backup plan if that doesn't shake out? Why that school? Tell me about a time. And so the first thing I tell my folks to do is, know the pillars of you, right? Everybody has these things, a time where you really knocked it out of the park. Do you have a really big spike for finance or financial modeling, making things up here? Do you really have a track record of, extracurricular involvement in sports and you really like teamwork? Know, say 5 really large things of you, and then you can really begin to either prepare for behavioral questions separately with questions that are a little bit more open-ended. Tell me about yourself. Why is X school your number one choice? You do have to do a little bit of preparation there, right? Specificity. Are you naming classes, clubs, professors? With your goals, are you going to the level of, I'm just interested in management consulting? Or are you saying, I'm interested in management consulting at an MBB firm in the healthcare venture, and that's toward my long-term goal of blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot there.
And follow-up afterwards?
Oh, thank you. Follow-up, I hope it's common practice that people do a thank you note. Oftentimes you're getting that interviewer's email or you're asking for it. It's in the Zoom link. And if you don't get it at all, you can send it to the admissions committee. I always still get the question, like, should I do a handwritten note? In my opinion, no. It was like lovely when I got them, but by the time I did, it was like a week after, like, who is this person? So a quick note, be specific. Hi, Kelsey, thank you so much for your time. I loved hearing about this particular thing. I loved hearing about your experience doing this thing. I'll check out that pizza place you recommended. Try to get to a level of specificity. Short, sweet, urgent, not the next day. If I had $1 for every time someone said, is 24 hours okay? Like, no, it's not okay. Just send it. It's not a long note.
So you mentioned a second ago, for example, that maybe a suboptimal career vision is, I want to do consulting with no other detail beyond that. What are some examples of like the why MBA or why our school question that you've seen fall flat?
There's the low hanging fruit of why MBA. I'm at a commercial real estate and, all the seniors above me have an MBA. So it's really expected of me, right? You have to show a level of, motivation and curiosity in that essay. And so if you're not getting to those particular things, I think a second thing is like lack of humility, right? That you're saying, I want to be a hedge fund manager. So, an MBA. In that question, maybe somewhere along the line, you're identifying gaps. Why the MBA? If I dig into that question, it could be why MBA versus a JD versus a specialized certificate in real estate. Where are your gaps? Be a little humble, be a little self-reflective in that answer. If you're not getting to that, hey, I've done X so far. I'd like to do X in the future. I have a gap here, and MBA will fill it in the following ways. It's a pretty okay answer. Why particular school? Was that the question of a bad example of that?
Yeah, that too.
That can go sideways in a couple of ways. I find that folks can ramble. That can often be the longest answer someone gives. Therefore, they start to trip themselves up. And then because it's this jumbled mess, it begins to trip the interviewer up because they can't really track what that person is saying, nor can they report on it. I have a framework that I use with my folks of top-down synthesis. Be as clear as possible. Almost answer like a consultant. What do consultants do? They tell you what they're going to tell you, then they tell you, and then they remind you what they just told you. And so have a synthesis sentence. X school is my number one choice for 2 main reasons, 3 main reasons. Then go into bullet points. If it's academics, what are the classes? How are they going to mitigate? Put you and that resource together, and how is it going to supercharge you? If it's the community, how do you know that thing? Have you been to 5 events? Have you talked to a lot of students? How have you experienced the community? You don't have to go to campus. Maybe there was a student blog that you read. Picture yourself in that community. What are you going to do there? Have a game plan. And by the way, you've written all these things out in your essays. And so everybody listening, please review your essays before you begin to interview prep because you've already answered these questions.
Can you say something about different cultural styles of communication? I think there's stereotypes that have some truth to them about Americans how they talk about themselves and what they want to do might be different than Europeans or people from East Asia. And obviously at a place like Columbia, you're getting applicants from everywhere. Is that taken into account? Is there, if you're an applicant from East Asia, do you try to present yourself more American, or are you aware of that broadly?
There's so much to unpack there. And it's a really good set of questions. I mean, first and foremost, you need to show up to the interview as you. You should not try to invent a new personality. That is a lot of time and a lot of effort, and you're probably not going to do it successfully. So no, whoever you are, everything that you've been in the last, 20 some odd years, that's who you need to show up as. Secondarily, with cultural nuances, admissions committees travel a lot, they read a lot, and so they need to at least know a little bit about, every single major culture to the best of their abilities. But the things that are red flags are not cultural nuances. Like, for example, we talked a lot about, being a jerk, right? That's not a cultural nuance. That is a personality defect. And so regardless of where you're from, that might come out in being rude, in rushing the interviewer, and being combative. Another one that, can be mitigated, not a cultural nuance, but maybe you can't answer a question, right? You are so incredibly nervous that you have to restart your sentences a lot. You have to ask for clarifications a lot. That's just a sign of being underprepared. And what we talked about a little bit before is admissions committees need to play that movie forward. And so what if this person can't really communicate well? Even if they're given softball questions, what might their classmates or learning teams or cohorts experience be with that person if they're just not able to communicate? So it's a really valid point you're bringing up, Brian, but I go back to what people think might be cultural nuances or differences. That's not the thing. It is the, really weak performances that are just ever present with some folks.
Yeah. So I think sometimes some of those weak performances are also driven by nerves. Do you have any advice for people on how to maybe mitigate those nerves, handle the nerves in the moment? What advice do you tend to give?
I do. I have a lot of advice there. So first, know that being nervous is a sign that you care about something. It is normal. Accept it. Second, if you are, especially for a virtual interview, right? My biggest tip there is get in the mode of being able to connect with somebody through a screen. And so go FaceTime mom or dad or your partner, right? What does it look like to be emotive or expressive on a video camera? The third thing is that sometimes some folks, even listening here, you might never be able to shake those nerves. Confront it. Say it. When you get on that video call, hi, Brian, so nice to meet you. I have to tell you, I'm a little nervous today, but I'm still really excited to speak with you. It's a really dehumanizing thing. And sometimes when you just get it out there in the world, it can dissipate, or your interviewer's like, don't worry, this is just a conversation. I mean, hopefully they say that.
And if you do feel like you really stumble at some point in the interview, do you have ideas about how to handle that? So maybe they ask a question and maybe you weren't expecting it or whatever. You just absolutely fall flat. Do you address it in the moment? Do you quickly move forward to the next thing?
Yeah, address it. Say, you know what? Well, actually, let me back up. If you get a question that you just don't know, ask for a moment. Can I have a moment? Have something to drink, like take a pause. So that's one thing. If you're still not able to hack it, say, you know what? Can we circle back to that question, right? If you just gave an answer and you're not proud of it, say, you know what, that wasn't my strongest performance. I'm sorry about that. What that can do, I mean, it's not ideal, don't get me wrong, but it's a human thing. To be able to recognize your weakness and not come across as like, I'm the absolute best, that was still a really great answer, that's not a fake it till you make it moment. That is a, hey, that actually wasn't so good. The beauty of the follow-up, in that email, you can say, my answer to that actually wasn't that great. I'd like to revisit it. Hey, this is what I would say instead. Don't write a paragraph. Maybe it's just a sentence. HBS is a really interesting one, right? Because oftentimes people end that interview feeling like they didn't do well at all. And then they've got that whole other essay in that post-interview reflection. There are some times where a client says, hey, I did not answer this well at all, or I gave completely wrong facts. And we address that in the post-interview reflection. I can remember one client, and she's just texted me from HBS right now. So she gave a factually incorrect answer. We addressed it in the post-interview follow-up. She's there right now.
Yeah, it happens to everyone. It's not ideal, but it's also not fatal if it happens. If you had to summarize, like what would be sort of the top 3 takeaways you want applicants to know about the purpose of the interview?
purpose of the interview is to do a double check, right? Is this the same person that showed up in their essays? Is the tone the same? Are the goals the same? Another one is to dig a little bit deeper. Is this person, enjoyable to be around? Are they throwing a bunch of red flags? If we throw them a behavioral question, are they full of BS? Are they actually able to confront these questions? And I think the third thing is really to build the class that they want, right? We talked a lot about what is the role of the admissions committee after the interview. And at that point, it's a puzzle game, right? What are the bits and pieces? And so I think that also goes back to, if I nail the interview, am I getting in? Well, no, because at every time, the admissions committee has a series of statistics and buckets. And that's not to say that there is quotas. There is absolutely not, but they really need to really thoughtfully and strategically piece it together.
All right. And my last question, at least, has to do with some school-specific nuances. So Wharton has a team-based discussion. Harvard has this deep conversation. They're looking for depth, et cetera. How much customization and additional time should people put into kind of understanding and mastering the school-specific nuances?
A lot. It's worth it. These interviews really, when you look at those, like Sloan versus HBS versus LBS versus Wharton, they are totally different formats. And they put a lot of time and a lot of thought into saying why that format's really good for them. With HBS, all those questions are customized. They dive incredibly deeply into your background for a reason. If they catch a whiff that something is not true or you're unprepared, they're going to catch that. And that's really good information for them to have. With the Wharton team-based discussion, if you go over 60 seconds, if your pitch is not that good, if you are a troublemaker in that group discussion, if you are unwilling to be the timekeeper, there's a lot of intricacies there, but they take note of that thing. And so you should spend a lot of time. You shouldn't over-prepare. That is absolutely a level that people can get to, but it is well worth it to understand what is the format and am I prepared to endure this or excel at it?
Yeah, it's funny when people say things like, oh, the HBS interview, like it's so much work to prepare. And I'm like, did you think getting into Harvard would be easy? Or with essays or whatever it might be, right? The MIT written application, which has the org chart and so many, like whatever it might be, like, oh, this is so much work. And I'm like, well, yeah, it should be a lot of, like, this is a competitive process. Like, what did you expect? Okay, so I think that we have covered a wide range of super informative and incredibly valuable topics. So thank you so much, Kelsey, for being here. And yeah, if people want to find you, what's the best place to reach you?
Oh, first, Mary Brian, thank you so much for the questions. This is a ton of fun. If anyone wants to have a chat with me to see if I'm a great fit for them, they can reach me over at embarkmba.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, Brian, as always, for the excellent, being my excellent co-host. We're always a good team, I think.
Welcome back. As part of our ongoing series where we look at applicant profiles and offer some suggestions and critiques, we have two applicants today. Applicant number one, we'll just give a quick bio. They're an Indian male. Their bachelor's degree was in mechanical engineering. Their GMAT is 675, GPA 9 out of 10. Their work experience, they have 4 years in business intelligence and analytics in a top 3 investment bank, but they're currently a project manager. Their career goals, as they describe them, are product management, strategy consulting, or asset management. Their target schools are Yale School of Management, Tuck, Darden, and Duke. So Maria, when you look over this profile, what are the things that pop out at you, concerns, things you want to know more about, ways that they can improve their application strength?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things about this, at least the profile as submitted, that are suboptimal. So I think for me, one of the things that really jumped out, and I know that you mentioned that this was a big question mark for you too, is learning a bit more about what is this person's leadership profile? What exactly is their role in the investment bank? So when I first read, oh, they work in an investment bank, that initially was a positive, right? I mean, we all know that getting jobs in investment banking is incredibly competitive, and surviving in investment banking is even more competitive. And so if this person's been at a top 3 bank for 4 years, that actually does lend itself to, wow, thinking that this person has a pretty elite background. However, I think it's important for our listeners to know that not all roles within a company are created equal. So it's fantastic if you've been working at a company that has a shiny and exciting name, but just because, if you have other resume twins from your company and you say, well, let's say I work at Goldman Sachs and every year Goldman Sachs sends people to my target schools, the devil really is in the details here. Like, they're not really your resume twin simply if they worked where you work. They're your resume twin if they worked where you work and they did what you do. So when this person says like, oh, I worked in business intelligence and analytics and I'm a project manager, that implies to me that maybe they are helping collect data, consolidate data, sort of like a back office, more of a supporting role. And so I think the challenge that someone like this has is that, and that, by the way, is not necessarily like the kiss of death, but I do think that they need to realize that the challenge for them is going to have to be really explaining where have those leadership and management growth opportunities been in a position that might not at first glance seem like it's one that lends itself well to a lot of leadership. How about you? What did you think?
Yeah, and let me tell you kind of the concern, and it's one that we've had with prior candidates as well, is the vague career goals. And it's not just vague; they're in some ways if not contradictory, they're quite different. So they listed career goals as product management, strategy consulting, or financial asset management. Those are three pretty different things, right? It's not quite as different as saying like dentist, jet pilot, or gravedigger, but like they're different enough that you need to probably pick a path. Now, I'll tell you what I sometimes hear from clients, and maybe you can give me a great answer, because I always try to get people to be more specific, right? And to pick a lane. And they'll push back and say, well, I don't want to be overly specific because I feel like if I narrow myself too much, then if that's not exactly what the school wants, then I'm just eliminating myself. And so there's a kind of prevailing idea out there that like, let me just cast a really wide net, and maybe in that process, somebody at the school will say, oh, like he among the things he likes are among the things that we like. So therefore, that's a good thing. Tell me why that's not the right approach.
Well, I think that the school is not going to be holding your hand and getting you a job, at least none of these US-based schools that this person is targeting, right? I think perhaps in some other countries, this person from India, my understanding is that sometimes the university itself might play a more active role in placing you or in helping you, making that introduction to the company or what have you. US business schools and US schools in general are not quite that way. The onus really is on you to carve that path for yourself, figure out what your path is, and then to carve the path for yourself. And so if you're trying to pursue three very, very different paths simultaneously, it's essentially impossible for any person to do that. So the school wants to see that when you come to their campus, you're not just going to flail around grasping at straws and running yourself ragged in 30 different directions, and then also running their career services ragged in 30 different directions and calling them every day and being like, well, today I decided that I want to do asset management, even though yesterday I wanted to do product management. They both have the word management in the word management, but aside from that, they are completely different paths. And so you yourself are not going to be able to realistically pursue all of these paths. There's only, unfortunately, 24 hours in a day. And so you're not going to be able to do that. And I think the schools want to see that you have done the research into, well, what are these post-MBA hiring companies actually even looking for? Because I think another myth to dispel, in addition to the myth that you brought up of like, well, they're looking for something, and so let me just mention all sorts of things, and maybe that'll be the thing that they're looking for. The other myth is that like, yeah, it doesn't matter what my background is. Business school will help me get any potential post-MBA job that I want. And that's simply not true. An asset management company would almost certainly want to see some pretty significant background in asset management. It's not impossible, but it will certainly be difficult for someone whose role has been in analytics, unless, of course, they themselves have been performing analyses on assets we don't know enough from the description. And similarly, like product management, there are some companies that they might not even want you to apply if you don't have a computer science degree. So I think the onus, again, is on the candidate to do the research and find out what is realistic. And then if you apply with a path that is realistic, that's 80% of it right there.
All right. And applicant number 2 is an African-American male, comes from a low-income, single-parent background, GMAT 705, GPA 6.3, strong regional school in Alabama. I don't know what that means, Auburn. Started in civil engineering, switched to finance, has worked for the last 4 years in financial analysis, program control for the government/DoD contracting. His post-career or his post-MBA career goals are short-term, wants to get into management consulting with a focus on due diligence and turnaround, long-term operational role in a PE firm or search firm. Now, this one doesn't have, like, I think the glaring red flags maybe that the first one had. Like, some of the career progression stuff seems to make more sense in terms of like who he is now and who he aspires to be. The GMAT's a little bit better. And I think part of that too is that, like, demographically, he's not competing. Indian male is kind of the most crowded demo for applicants. And so that GMAT score is probably going to hurt the first applicant more. But here, the GMAT score is 28 points better or whatever, at any rate. Do you have big picture thoughts on our second applicant in terms of either concerns or things you liked or next steps for them?
Yeah, I think the GMAT's actually pretty strong, right? Under the old GMAT, the old GMAT scale, it would have been around a 750. So I'm guessing this person's probably somewhere in the 99 to 98th, 99th percentile. So right off the bat, that I think that's great. The GPA, I mean, is a smidge underneath an average for a lot of the schools, but I mean, so small that it's virtually negligible. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting background. I think the one advice I would give is that, so the career goal says to go into management consulting, due diligence, and turnarounds. Again, it's important to do research into what sorts of backgrounds get those sorts of jobs. So in my experience, at least based on what I've seen, in order to do that due diligence consulting, it's often very useful to have a CPA and to have done a lot of auditing before, because often those really heavy financial due diligence roles require like digging through mountains and mountains of bank statements and financial statements. And that's not to say that this person could not eventually learn to do it. And that's not to say that everyone who does financial due diligence is someone who has a deep accounting background, but realize that oftentimes that might be, so it's again, the onus is on the applicant to say, like, actually, Maria, I spoke to 5 different people who do due diligence consulting, and they all said that my background is perfect. Great, perfect. Prove me wrong. But just in case, it would be good to know, because what a lot of folks might not realize is that if I see a candidate who's really strong, but I'm a little concerned about, like, turnarounds and due diligence, they do financial analysts and control, like the control work might not be enough. I'll actually go down the hall to career services and I'll show them this person's background. And I'll say, like, in your experience, did this person get this sort of job? So from a admissions perspective, from the admissions story, what I would say is, yeah, keep the management consulting piece, but consider tweaking it to do government focused consulting. A lot of the top consulting firms have DC offices that do government consulting. This person's already been working with government and the Department of Defense. So I think that might help. That might sort of flow a little bit more easily. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, all that makes sense. And to be honest, like, with the notes that I made when I was going through are mostly things that are just not answered on here. So I'd want to know a little bit more about their leadership experiences. It seems that they manage teams. But, like, tell me more about that, right? There's a lot of, like, tell me more about these things, types of things. And so I don't have a huge concern, like, here's like a major shift that this applicant will need to make in their application or their strategy for admissions in quite the same way that the first applicant had.
Agreed.
All right. Thank you very much, Maria. As always, it's a pleasure doing this with you. And that is it for today's episode of the GMAT Club Podcast. I'm Brian Phoebe with Gurufy.com, and this is Maria McVilla with ApplicantLab.com, and we will see you on the next episode.